Julian Lennon's life has been defined by his father's choices, leaving him feeling like an outsider in his own family. It's a story shaped by the immense shadow of a global icon, a story of a boy searching for a father who was more present on records than in his own home. But it was his relationship with one woman, the woman who replaced his mother, that became the center of a quiet war, a conflict fueled by what he saw as decades of neglect and deep resentment. He has expressed a universe of pain about his stepmother, Yoko Ono, a pain so deep it colors every part of his story. So, what could make a son feel such intense, lasting bitterness towards the woman his father loved? What were the events, the slights, the betrayals that built a wall between them so high it seemed impossible to ever see over? This is the story of that complicated relationship and the painful, deeply human reasons behind the anger. To understand where it all started, we have to go back to a time before Yoko, before the divorce, to a family that was, at least on the surface, whole. Before John Lennon was a global peace icon, he was a young, ambitious art student in Liverpool. In 1958, he met Cynthia Powell. She was his opposite in many ways, poised and well-spoken, from a more stable background. He was, in her words, a real scruff, a real teddy boy, with a rebellious energy that both scared and fascinated her. Their relationship was intense from the start, marked by John's famous temper, a trait many chalk up to the scars of his own tough childhood, and losing his mother, Julia, so young. Their romance played out as John's music career was exploding. When Cynthia found out she was pregnant in 1962, the world was on the verge of Beatlemania. Back then, management thought a married Beatle with a kid would be a commercial disaster. Their wedding was a rushed, secret affair at a registry office. Beatles manager Brian Epstein was the best man, but none of their family was there. Afterward, there was no party, just a quick lunch before John had to run off to a gig. This set the tone for their life together. John's career always came first, and the family was often an inconvenient secret. On April 8, 1963, John Charles Julian Lennon was born. But the world didn't know. For months, his existence was kept from the press and screaming fans, a tiny footnote in the massive story of the Beatles. Cynthia was left to handle being a new mom mostly on her own, a lonely figure in the eye of the storm. While John toured the world, she was at home, trying to build a normal life that John himself seemed only partially interested in. The years at their home in Kenwood should have been perfect. They were living a life of unbelievable fame and fortune. But for young Julian, it was just confusing. His father was like a ghost, appearing and disappearing, his moods totally unpredictable. Julian has spoken about this time with a mix of longing and confusion. He's famously said there seemed to be more photos of him playing with Paul McCartney than with his own dad. John could be funny and charming, but also cold and harsh. His temper, made worse by the pressures of fame and his growing drug use, made their home a tense place. This wasn't a perfect family torn apart. It was a fragile one, built on a rushed marriage and strained by a global phenomenon. Cynthia wanted a normal life with a husband who was around. John was looking for something else entirely. Those cracks in their foundation were there long before a new person came into the picture. But when she did, those cracks would shatter. And for a 5-year-old boy, the world would break in two. The story of how John Lennon met Yoko Ono is rock and roll mythology. It was November 1966 at a London art gallery. John was intrigued by her conceptual art, especially a piece where you climb a ladder to look through a magnifying glass at a tiny word on the ceiling. Yes. For John, who felt stuck creatively and unhappy with his life, Yoko was a breath of fresh air. She represented an artistic freedom that was the total opposite of his suburban life in Kenwood. Their connection grew over months, from an artistic crush into an intense, all-consuming affair. The end of his marriage to Cynthia was brutally simple. In May 1968, Cynthia came home early from a vacation. She walked into her house to find John sitting on the floor with Yoko, who was wearing Cynthia's bathrobe. It was a quiet, devastating confirmation of her worst fears. The dream was over. That moment, Cynthia later recalled, was sort of curtains for our marriage. What followed was a messy and public divorce. John, in a rush to start his new life with Yoko, was not exactly generous. He initially accused Cynthia of adultery to get the upper hand. Cynthia later wrote that John first offered her only $75,000 in a settlement, telling her over the phone she wasn't worth more. The final settlement was eventually raised, but it was a tiny fraction of his massive and growing wealth. For 5-year-old Julian, it was terrifying and impossible to understand. One day his father lived with him. The next, he was gone, replaced by a constant media storm about John and Yoko. Their bed-ins for peace, their avant-garde films. It was a world with no room for a little boy from a previous life. Julian has said that after the divorce, his father disappeared off the face of the planet. He and his mother were pushed aside while John started a new, highly publicized chapter. Julian was uprooted from the huge Kenwood estate and moved with his mom to a much smaller home. His life went from privileged chaos to quiet uncertainty. He became a mother's boy, clinging to the only stability he had left. He missed his dad, but the man he saw on TV and in the papers was a stranger. The pain of this abandonment was sharp and created a wound that would fester for years. This was the Great Divide. Yoko's arrival didn't just cause a divorce. It split Julian's life into a before and an after. Before, he was the son of a famous but present father. After, he was a living reminder of a family John chose to leave behind. After the divorce, Julian's life changed forever. While John and Yoko were staging global peace campaigns, his first son was dealing with a deep sense of turmoil. Julian has said he felt like he and his mother were completely cast aside. He saw his father maybe once a year. Sometimes years went by with no contact. For a kid, this absence was a constant, painful void. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on him. He later put it bluntly. Dad could talk about peace and love out loud to the world, but he could never show it to the people who supposedly meant the most to him, his wife and son. This became the core of his feelings about his father, a man who preached universal love, but didn't practice it at home. But during this time, an unlikely father figure stepped in, Paul McCartney. Paul was fond of Cynthia and Julian and was worried about them. One day in 1968, he drove out to visit. On the way, thinking about the sad little boy who'd lost his dad, a melody and a comforting phrase came to mind. "Hey, Jules." That phrase, of course, became "Hey, Jude," one of the most beloved songs ever. McCartney's gesture was pure compassion. Julian has said he felt closer to Paul than his own father back then. The song became a bittersweet symbol for Julian, a worldwide anthem of comfort born from his private pain. A brief glimmer of hope came during John's lost weekend. From mid-1973 to early 1975, John separated from Yoko and lived with their assistant, May Pang. Pang pushed John to reconnect with his son. For the first time in years, Julian spent real, happy time with his dad. They went to Disney World, and Julian remembers his dad being happy and full of laughter. "My memories of that time with Dad and May are very clear. They were the happiest time I can remember with him," Julian said. But it didn't last. John got back together with Yoko. Then, on October 9, 1975, Yoko gave birth to their son, Sean. For Julian, this was another major blow. While he has always loved his half-brother, Sean's birth cemented his place as an outsider. John famously retired from music for 5 years to be a house husband for Sean, giving his second son a level of attention he never gave his first. John made this disparity painfully public in a 1980 interview, saying Sean was a planned child, while Julian came out of a whiskey bottle on a Saturday night. For Julian, hearing those words was devastating. It was a public announcement of his place in his father's life, confirming his deepest fear that he was just an accident. The birth of his brother and his father's devotion to him just highlighted everything Julian had missed out on. The shadow of his father had grown longer and darker, and at its center was a new family, one he would never truly belong to. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was murdered in New York City. He was only 40. For his 17-year-old son, Julian, the news didn't come from a family member, but from the cold, impersonal media. The shock was immense, but it was soon followed by a different kind of pain, a betrayal that would last for nearly 2 decades. When John Lennon's will was revealed, it laid bare Julian's exclusion in cold, legal terms. The estate, valued at a massive $220 million, was left almost entirely in a trust for Yoko Ono and their son, Sean. Yoko was also named the sole executor, giving her total control over John's money, legacy, and music. And Julian, in the context of that massive fortune, he was left with practically nothing. The will made no specific provision for him. A pre-existing trust from the divorce would give Julian some money when he turned 21, but even that had to be split with any future children John had. When Sean was born, Julian's share was cut in half. It was a final, posthumous statement from his father about his worth. Julian felt that Yoko had influenced his father when he wrote the will, ensuring he was left out. The pain was made worse because he was just starting to reconnect with his dad. In the last years of John's life, they had started talking on the phone more, but that chance was stolen, and the will felt like a final slammed door. The immediate aftermath was surreal. Julian was called to New York by a grieving Yoko. He remembers having to be strong for her as she was cracking up all the time. She even asked for his advice on how to tell young Sean his father was gone. But this shared grief quickly turned into suspicion. In one bizarre incident, an anonymous messenger gave Julian one of his father's guitars. Yoko, suspecting it was connected to stolen diaries, allegedly flew Julian back to New York to sign a confession that he knew nothing about them. The message was clear. Yoko was the gatekeeper of all things Lennon. This wasn't just about money, but also the most personal items. The ultimate sting for Julian was having to watch his father's personal belongings, letters he wrote as a child, postcards, drawings, sold at auction. He was forced to bid on and buy back his own memories. "The irony isn't lost on me," he was quoted as saying, "that I am using his money to buy back his things." It was a humiliating ordeal, a constant reminder that he was an outsider to his own family's history. The disinheritance kicked off one of the longest legal battles in music history. For Julian, this wasn't just about money. It was a desperate, 16-year fight for acknowledgement as John Lennon's firstborn son. He felt he'd been deliberately written out of his father's legacy and was determined to fight it. Julian sued the estate, claiming his father had failed to provide for him and that Yoko had exerted undue influence. It was a classic showdown, the forgotten son versus the powerful stepmother controlling a fortune. The legal war was a draining marathon that lasted from 1980 to 1996. Yoko had the full financial weight of the estate, worth hundreds of millions, to fund her defense. Julian, on the other hand, was in a much tougher spot. He and his mother lived modestly, and he had to work for his own money. Through the 80s and early 90s, Julian was also trying to build his own music career. His 1984 debut album, Valot, was a huge success, even earning him a Grammy nomination. But he was always compared to his father, a shadow he couldn't escape. All the while, the legal fight churned on in the background, a constant source of bitterness. He gave interviews that showed his deep frustration, feeling Yoko was deliberately blocking him. His resentment toward her hardened during this long, bitter war. He saw her as the person responsible for his exclusion, both when his father was alive and, most painfully, after he died. Finally, in 1996, after 16 exhausting years, they reached a settlement out of court. The terms were secret, sealed by a non-disclosure agreement, but at the time, media reports estimated it was around $20 million. While a lot of money, it was just a fraction of the Lennon estate's total value. Had John died without a will, Julian would have been entitled to a much larger share, possibly around 25% of the estate. Even with the settlement, Julian has said he didn't feel the outcome was fair. He saw it as a compromise to end the draining. Battle against an opponent with seemingly endless resources. Settling allowed him to finally move on. The war for his inheritance was over, but the fight for his own peace of mind was another story. After the brutal 16-year legal war, the relationship between Julian Lennon and Yoko Ono was a wasteland. Trust was shattered. Resentment was deep. But over time, a fragile, unlikely truce began to form. And the person who built that bridge was the one who connected them both to John, Sean. Despite the painful history between their families, Julian has always had a deep and unwavering love for his younger half-brother. He never blamed Sean for his own pain. He just saw him as his brother. This bond became the single most important key to healing. As Sean grew up and started his own music career, he and Julian became, in Julian's words, best buddies. This created a new dynamic. To have a relationship with Sean, Julian had to find a way to coexist with Sean's mother. He explained his motivation perfectly in an interview. If I hurt Sean's mother, then I hurt Sean. It's a roundabout way of thinking about things, but because I love Sean so much, I just don't want to hurt him. This shows an incredible amount of grace. He consciously chose his brother's happiness over his own long-held anger. This new civility started to show in public. In a moment that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier, on September 16, 2010, the 5 people most connected to John's life, Julian, his mother Cynthia, Yoko, Sean, and John's former partner, May Pang, all gathered for the opening of Julian's photo exhibition in New York. Photos from the event show them smiling and embracing, a public display of unity that signaled a major thaw. Julian has made it clear this isn't about forgetting the past, but finding a way to live with it. The pain of his childhood and the bitterness of the inheritance fight are part of his story. But he has worked toward forgiveness, mostly for his own well-being. He realized holding onto that anger was only hurting himself. The peace between Julian and Yoko isn't necessarily a warm friendship, but it is one of mutual respect, born from a shared love for Sean. The rage has softened, replaced by a hard-won calm. The bridge named Sean didn't magically close the gap between them, but it made it possible to cross. Julian Lennon's story is a powerful look at the complexities of family, fame, and forgiveness. The resentment he felt for Yoko Ono was never just about one thing. It was the result of a lifetime of feeling like a side character in his own father's story, second to the Beatles, second to a new love, and finally second to a new family. The 16-year legal battle wasn't just about money, but a desperate cry to be seen and acknowledged as an equal son. While a fragile peace, built on his love for his brother Sean, has settled over the years, the scars are still there. They're a reminder of the boy comforted by Paul McCartney because his own father was gone, the teenager who heard of his father's death on the news, and the man who had to buy back his own childhood memories from auction houses. His journey has been about moving past the anger, not by forgetting it, but by choosing to find a place of peace. He took the sad song of his life and, in his own time, began to make it better. If you found this story compelling, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into music history, and check out our other video on the screen now.